Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first of this week's Digital Think-ins. I'm Liz Moseley. I'm just back from a few weeks off, so I may be a little rusty. I've had a haircut, as you can see. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you very much, all of you, for braving the heat to be with us today for what is an important exploratory thinking, in which we don't have live investigation happening on this topic at the moment. What we're doing this evening is working with you all and listening to you all to try and find an angle of a useful piece of investigation on this topic that we think that we can add something new to the conversation. For those of you, if anybody hasn't been to a digital thinking before, we call them a forum for civilized disagreement. There are several ways for you to get involved. We've got some brilliant experts in the topic that are going to help us get the ball rolling. But I really do want to hear from you. If you'd like to come on screen, then let me know in the chat function. You can find the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and my colleague James Wilson will be there. There he is. Hello, James. Chatting and what have you. If you don't want to talk on screen, that's fine too. Just let us know. You can type instead of talk, or put your little blue digital hand up, and I'll come to as many of you as I can. When we originally conceived of this, we are recording the session as we always do, and we use the best bits on social media and in the app and what have you, so just be aware of that. And it just really helps us, if you would like to join in, to change your name to your real name if you can. Just it helps us to know. If I say I can go to, you know, Bill rather than iPhone, it just helps us to know who's here. When we originally conceived of this conversation, it was myself and my colleague Dave Taylor about 6 weeks ago. We were talking to a colleague who just moved into, in London, a new rented flat with a couple of friends. And she was saying that she was able to afford a much nicer rented property than the one she had been looking at in February before lockdown. She'd previously been living with her mum and dad. And it just sort of twinkled a little thought in Dave's mind, accompanied with some pieces, some investigative reporting pieces that had been talking about the fate of Airbnb in the capital. Obviously, its market sort of dropped away from it dramatically, and suddenly it was facing a sort of business model challenge. And obviously, the sort of more urgent and frightening looming end to the moratorium on evictions, which ends, it was extended for a couple of months and now ends on the 23rd of August. There was some data released by Shelter in early July that talked about 230,000 or so renters who had fallen into arrears with their rent since the start of the pandemic. So there were a lot of sort of factors at play, and whilst there was lots of interesting things, we just weren't sure yet at Tortoise what there was for us to go at, to understand. There are evidently some winners and some losers from what's happened to the private residential rental market in particular in the pandemic, but we needed to figure out how that all plays out. And what I'm hoping to do this evening is to talk with our experts and with you to sort of see what there is for us to say on the topic. I'd like to just do a quick show of hands. It's much easier to do this when we're all physically together than it is on digital, but just to get a bit of a sense of it. And I'd love to hear your own experiences if you have them. Myself, I'm a private tenant now. If you feel comfortable putting up your little blue digital hand, anybody here who is currently renting the house in which they live, would be useful for me to know how many people are experiencing this, you know, in real life. There's a inherent power gap, I think, being a private renter, one that I encounter myself in a small way every time I have to ask my landlady to fix the leaking shower or come and look at the mold that's growing in the pantry or whatever. So there's quite a lot of people here who are private renters. And then just, if you put your digital hands down, is there anybody here who is a private landlord, who owns a property that somebody is renting from them, who's sort of from the other side of the fence? Couple of people on the other side. Okay, so we're more renters than rentees, if that makes sense. Okay, that's really helpful to know. Let's start, if we can, with Anne Ashworth, who is here. Hi, Anne. Anne is somebody who I've read a lot of, influential property journalist and personal finance expert and what have you. And I think I wanted to come to Anne first to just get this going. There's a lot about the property market that is a sort of the great unknowable. It's why we're all obsessed with it in this country, it seems. Could you just sort of give us a bit of a bluffer's guide on what are the key things that we need to know about what has changed and what is coming, particularly in relation to private residential renting at the moment?
Right. The private rented sector caters for about 5 million households in Britain. Now that's quite a lot of people, and they aren't all young. It now caters for a great many more families than in the past, and we also can envisage that a lot of people will be renting into retirement, which will pose problems in it of itself. Now, if this session had a signature tune, it would be that great song to which we've all danced and sung along, Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent. However, you wouldn't have thought that if you had read the government's planning consultation document, which was published early last Thursday morning, where the word rent is only mentioned once. Much to my surprise, it got me quite hot under the collar, because it's a sector for which we need decent policies, because it is quite clear not everybody will wants or can achieve home ownership, so we need to have great quality accommodation for that group. Now, what's happening to rents? The latest evidence from Zoopla and the other property portfolios is that rents are going down in London, and that's thanks to the extra supply coming onto the market. Flats that used to be rented out on Airbnb are now available for long-term rent, and that's pushing down rents in London and in Edinburgh. Elsewhere, rents are trending upwards, perhaps as landlords are leaving the market following a succession of tax changes that made it less advantageous and less lucrative to be a landlord. But I would say, what would we do without private landlords? Who else would be housing those people? Another significant omission in the planning document was any talk of build to rent, these American-style custom-built rental blocks, which aim to give you a really good service, concierge, super fast Wi-Fi, and everything else that you need to have a decent life as a renter. Who knows what the plans will be for those, and anybody who's even got savings should be interested in what's happening to build to rent, because that's where pension funds and insurers who look after our money would like to invest for long-term returns. So whatever happens in the debate about housing, we need to talk about rents, we need to talk about the level of rents, and we also need to talk about the power play, as it's been said before, between private sector landlords and tenants, because it is not clear what is going to happen later this month when the ban on evictions is taken off. Will landlords show tolerance towards their tenants? A great many will do, because not everybody that is a private sector landlord is an evil ogre, but some won't. Where will those people find accommodation? There are so many issues facing us, and I sometimes wonder whether anybody's got a handle on everything that we need to take account of to form proper policies in this sector.
Thank you very much, Anne. And what a beautiful segue to our next invited speaker, who is Tom Copley, who is the Deputy Mayor for Housing here in London. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Hiya. So I guess picking up on what Anne was just talking about, a question I would have for you is, why is it, do you think, that rent is so under-regarded in property policy, the way that the sort of government in particular, and we take the white paper as a case in point, given it affects, you know, the thick end of 9 million adults and, you know, all of those, it seems to be a very real reality for a huge, huge number of people, not just you know, your classic 20-somethings, you know, going it alone for the first time. Why is it that rent doesn't seem to be taken as seriously as, for example, property prices?
I think that is an excellent point, and actually we've seen it in the government's response to COVID as well. The renters were a bit of a second thought. So, you know, the mortgage holiday was announced, and the mortgage holiday was absolutely right, of course. But it then took the government a while before they, you know, addressed renters. And renters, you know, as I say, the mortgage holiday is the right thing, but renters are actually in a much more precarious position than homeowners. And at every stage during the government's response, housing response to COVID, it's felt like renters have been a second thought. And of course, London, of course, has the greatest share proportionally of renters of any part of the country. More than a quarter, it'll soon be a third of Londoners rent from a private landlord. I think one of the things that really surprises people, because, you know, my role as deputy mayor for London, the deputy mayor for housing, I find frustrating, and I know Sadiq Khan finds frustrating, is that we have no power at City Hall over the private rented sector. And I think this is something that often surprises people from other cities around the world. Where, you know, you've got Berlin, where they've got, you know, famously rent control. Other cities like, you know, Barcelona and Madrid, much more ability and much more power over the private rented sector. So we are completely in London at we're at the sort of mercy of the government to actually do something to help private renters. And the mayor set out his ask, which is, he set out his blueprint for renting, the London model, which would include rent control. But this is not something, of course, that this government rent control is not something that this government is in favour of. And, you know, I've been very much in favour of having all of this devolved down to City Hall.
Yeah, it's interesting that before so once lockdown had started happening and it was clear that the mortgage holiday, as you say, went in, I was surprised actually, and I only realised this when researching for this conversation, that if you are a buy-to-let landlord, you also only had to self-certify that your financial circumstances had changed in order to get a mortgage holiday, but clearly your tenant didn't have that option, or in many cases hasn't had that option unless they've agreed it privately, and that was a surprise to me. I just wonder about the specifics of the end of the moratorium on evictions. So the 23rd of August will hit, and then if you are one of those households who's fallen into arrears as a result of COVID, I know that there is a amend to the requirement for the court case. If you are taken to court by your landlord, they have to demonstrate they've taken account of that or something, but they still have no fault eviction at their disposal and the Section 8 at their disposal. That was something that people were lobbying quite hard before the recess to get changed, because clearly the recess won't have ended by the time the courts get up and running again. Where are we at with all that? And if you're in that situation, what are your options if you're a household in that situation?
Sure. Okay, so I'm very worried about the ban on evictions coming to an end. And it's not that I think that there should be a sort of indefinite on evictions. Obviously, at some point it has to come to them. But the important thing is the government needs to put in place measures to protect tenants before it ends the eviction ban, which it's not done. And, you know, the government already has a pledge. It already has a pledge to abolish no-fault eviction.
Yeah.
I think it should get on and do that. It needs to amend the what's called the Section 8 eviction, to make arrears due to COVID a discretionary rather than mandatory ground for eviction. And also we need to make sure that the welfare benefit system is able to cover the cost of rent for people who are affected by COVID-19. You know, that support that has to exist. And it's not just a ban on eviction, because it's not just a ban on eviction coming to an end that I'm worried about. It's also when furlough ends. I think that's really when it's going to hit people, because that's when people's income is going to disappear. That's when they're not going to be able to pay the rent, and that's when the landlord is going to be serving the eviction notice. Now, one thing to emphasise and for people to remember: if you're serving an eviction notice, you don't have to leave the moment you get the eviction notice. Your landlord has to take you to court in order to evict you. And if you, so you know, a lot of tenants, they will leave the moment that they get the eviction notice. You don't have to.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to come, just a couple of hands are up in the chat before we come to Lewis in a second. Emmeline Brothers has had a hand up for a while, a little blue hand. Are you there, Emmeline? Emmeline Brothers, are you there with your blue hand up? Can't see you actually. No, perhaps her hand has remained up by accident. Okay, well, let's go William Jeremy then. Hi, William. Hiya. We'll just unmute William and then we can hear
that. Yes, I've got an interesting, a slightly different perspective on this one, because I both come from a family business, which is a mixture of law and property. So we are in a very minor way landlords, but I'm also what is known technically as a non-owning spouse, because I'm married to a lady who owns the property, as it were. That's just sort of a bit of background, I guess, but it's more of a sort of philosophical observation, which says that probably 30 out of the last 40 years, we have had an economy that's based on people being encouraged to own and go on what's called the housing ladder.
Yeah.
And in many cases, people have had to sort of shackle themselves to large mortgages, depending on, you know, where and when circumstances, in order to achieve a measure of both security and if you like, developing an asset which is then tradable. And just when did this business of a home not being somewhere to live so much as somewhere to invest in as well take hold historically is something which
I think that's fascinating, William, because I think it is, to an extent, I don't know if it's uniquely British, but it does feel to me that that's not the case in all countries of the world, which is, again, possibly a nice segue into Lewis Mendes, who is a Portuguese geographer, is what you are, Lewis, and you have done a lot of work, academic work, in the study of what you call turbo gentrification, and particularly the impact of Airbnb, for example, on available housing stock. And what I think is really interesting is what has happened in Lisbon since the pandemic started in relation to private rents is rather different in terms of power. Would you just tell us a little bit of the story of the activists and how that's all played out in Lisbon?
Of course. Let me just thank for the invitation. It's so nice to be here with you, Elizabeth, Anne and Tom. I'm not an English speaker, so forgive me if I don't express myself clearly.
You're doing
in your language. Thank you. Well, yes, before COVID, maybe just 1 minute to try to explain how Lisbon really enters in the real estate world markets. I mean, there are 4 major causes of an enormous housing crisis that we have been experiencing, especially in Lisbon and Porto, the main cities of Portugal, since the last financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So basically, all our urban recovery was based on over-tourism, touristification, the expansion of Airbnb in the inner city especially, and by the real estate dynamics. Those were the 2 axes of urban recovery for our economy. And that's a mistake, because that makes, basically we are talking about speculative economy. We are not talking about productive economy. I totally identify myself with what the other participants said, especially William now, because he points out one of the things that are more common in all the metropolis in the world. And Lisbon wasn't like that 10 years ago, and now it is. That is turning a home and a house is not, it's empty of its social content as a human rights. and it gained the value of a financial asset. So we have over-tourism in Lisbon, we have financiarization of housing, which means that we are talking about not just the injection of foreign investment in the built environment, but in the attraction of that capital to the rehabilitation of the built environment, which is very important. It has a positive side. But we have to also see the real estate speculation, the super or turbo gentrification that appear, and all the aggravated residential segregation. And in the last 10 years, a lot of urban social movements, collectivities, associations came together and got a lot of experience and memory and collective learning to try to fight all these major forces that now are shaping the urban landscape of our cities. And of course, London, you guys have that for 30 years, 4 decades. Not us. No, we have this super gentrification. Even the prototype of gentrification is something that is very, very new in Lisbon. It has at the most 10 years. So speaking about the urban social movements, it was quite interesting because they came together, they unified themselves. They are very different. We have associations that come from the more extreme left, like Habita, until the most still in the spectrum of the left wing, but more conservative, like for instance the Lisbon Tenants Association, or where I'm a board member, and all these different associations and collectivities, they came together, taking advantage of their differences, but coming really complementary and integrated in a very unified fight to try to alert our government, especially national government, but also the city hall, to the special condition that housing market was during the COVID period. And really there were, we put out several open letters, petitions, manifestos, did campaigns. We were not allowed to do public resistance and demonstrations on the streets, but we did it on the sofa. It was a kind of sofa activism, which worked very, very well. And in fact, in several days after some of the manifestos and the open letters came into public, the government, in the record period, like 4 days, the President of the Republic was already signing some laws, exceptional laws that came 3 or 4 days after some virtual and demonstrations, putting into force the need to stop evictions, and give some kind of hope to tenants.
So what the activists won in Lisbon, was it the same thing that the national government here had implemented anyway, where there was basically you couldn't be evicted for a given period? Was that what the activists in Lisbon were fighting for and got in the end?
Well, they were a little bit more radical.
Okay.
They wanted also the putting AirBnB, vacant apartments, unities, to support homeless people and try to accommodate all tenants or other people that hadn't an opportunity to appropriate or have access to a home, to a house. Mm-hmm. So they did that. But the government didn't accept that. What was quite interesting was that the evictions were stopped until September, but now the period is already got longer until December. So we have all kind of evictions stopped until December, and they were by the national government. They were created some kind of it was a kind of direct support that the tenants could apply if the tenants didn't have money because of the layoff or the unemployment that is high in this period. As you know, the tenants could apply to a loan to the Institute of Housing, the National Institute of Housing.
Okay.
But that loan would come with interests.
Right.
And so we are talking about yes, and we are talking about people that come from a lower economic social status, like Tom phrase that majority of the tenants come from. So the government created a program. That program is not getting a lot of success. But what is happening is that the City Hall, let me just tell you this in 30 seconds, the City Hall created a very interesting program that permits a kind of connection between community and markets. So this is the state trying to regulate and mediate these two main forces. So we have a lot of empty Airbnb apartments. Yeah. We have a lot of people that want to rent an affordable house in Lisbon. So yes, what the municipality did was that they rented apartments with a rent cap, with a maximum limit of rent, not rent gap, but rent cap.
Okay.
And they rented to the private sector, and now they subrented to the people in need. So this is quite interesting. Of course, we are talking about a program that doesn't have more than 200, 300 houses, but they want to achieve until December 1,000. It's not much, but it's a kind of, but the experience is valid and positive by the motto. And so you have all over in the Independent and all over in the most biggest international newspapers, you have a reference to that program that the City Hall is implementing since like 2 months ago.
Thank you very much, Lewis. I'm really interested in Airbnb as an organisation. We've done a ton of work at Tortoise in we call it Tech Nation series. Airbnb is a different kind of business. It's a hotel chain, really, kind of a travel business. But we've talked a lot about how people feel, consumers feel about Amazon. There are there's a moral high ground argument that relates to Amazon that's quite complicated. We've heard play out a lot in ThinkIns. And I just wonder if Airbnb is another one of those brands that as the impact of it on people's quality of life, on the availability of housing stock, on literally on people's ability to live in a place that is safe. It's such a huge influence in sort of rewiring geographies of places. I wonder if it might become one of those brands that has people who just don't and people who still do for its convenience and everything else. I'm just interested to kind of observe that, and also how governments and legislators will interact with it to mitigate its worst impacts on the human geography and indeed personal finance, health of urban centres particularly. I'm going to come to some of the people who've been making fascinating comments in the chat. I know Paul's always got good stuff to say. I'm going to come to you in a second, Paul, so bear with me. I'd like to come to Jess Dowson, who is talking about quality, and this talks a little bit to what Anne said at the beginning about it's all very well to build stuff, but it also needs to be good stuff. Hi, Jess. Can we hear Jess?
Hi, sorry, I'm just vacating.
Hastily moving to another location. Talk a little bit about your comment there about housing quality as well as amount. Is he still there? Is he gone? Oh, Jess, you were literally there.
Sorry, there we go. Brief background, I'm currently a RABA Part 1 architectural assistant Part 2 in a couple of weeks.
So it's up to you.
My concern around the quality of housing is brought up an awful lot during our undergraduate, because quite a few of the tutors are based in London, as well as our own.
Oh, I think we might have lost. Him. We'll come back. Let's go to Paul Atherton, because I know Paul's there. I can see his face and his hat and his glasses. We'll try and come back to Jess if we can get him back. Hiya, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Are you still in your accommodation that was provided? You've managed to stick it out?
Yeah, by shift. So for those who don't know, I was housed in Heathrow before lockdown, which is what I call my bedroom. And then as part of everyone in, I was housed in hotel accommodation here in Marylebone, where I'm still currently at. Okay. The council, who are supposed to be housing everybody, aren't. But I've kind of fallen through the gaps at the moment, with most people being on holiday for the past month. So I'm going to find out what happens in the next week or so.
Right, okay. You've been talking a lot about right to buy and the sort of shifting dynamics historically on people getting access in particularly social housing. Just tell us a little bit about your experiences and perspectives on that stuff.
Yeah, well, I suppose it really kind of starts when I was growing up as a kid, because, you know, the idea of home ownership was quite a lavish concept when I was younger. So I was born in '68, and I grew up in the '70s and sort of became aware of things in the early '80s. And then I came into the rental market, and I was renting in Cardiff when I first moved out. But by the time I was 20, as somebody mentioned in the chat room, it was cheaper to buy than it was to rent. And of course, this is in a time where people were just moving into the market, and it was just simply, you just did the maths with all the additional expenses of surveyors and insurance and maintenance and all the rest of it. It was just cheaper to buy than it was to rent. But then when you came to London, the idea of buying in London was nobody ever thought you'd own a property in London. It was all just considered rental market. But again, when I came to rent here, and this was all along the South Bank, most of the properties were costing me between £400 a month to £600 a month. And these now properties that retail out to £2,500 to £4,000 a week. And that's been the dramatic change in central London. There's been a complete overhaul now to just exploiting renters, but there's an ever increasing rent. So during that period of time, it went from up until 1980, there were rent controls in the UK, so that you couldn't have these insane price rises. And we had long-term tenancy. So, you know, when I first got my first tenancy, you'd be expected to be in that premises for 3 years. Most people actually expected to be in whatever premise they were in for life, which was true pretty much of all continental Europe. Yeah. So these are the big changes that I've noticed, especially with the rise of Airbnb, short-termism. Everybody's going, right, we'll kick you out after 6 months because we can make more money. The buy-to-let mortgage created a landlord that didn't really understand the property market, so that shifted everything. Yeah. So you've got buy-to-let, you've got the demise of the sort of corporate landlords, you've got the demise of social housing, you've got a complete inverse in terms of supply and demand. I mean, here in London, the demand is clearly for low-cost social housing, but what's being built is, we have to call them luxury because you really wouldn't know otherwise, but luxury flats that are being built which are 2/3 empty. There is no demand for these at all now, but we're still, planning permission is granted for yet another skyscraper on a skyline, and nobody wants them. So it's now making everybody wonder, well, why are they still building them when there's clearly no demand?
Let's go back to Tom Copley. Thanks, Paul. There's a couple of comments. Stephen R has said how he is against rent control. I know you're very pro rent control. I'm interested in a package of solutions to the challenges, the pressures that Paul has just sort of eloquently listed of how we've ended up in this situation, even before COVID-19 then came and sort of walloped us again. There seems to be, as a complete layperson, I always feel anxious when I hear government announcements about the plans to build affordable housing, even if it was affordable when it came, and even if it was to an acceptable quality and standard. It just takes too long. And so there's a sort of gap in that sort of supply side feed, and then the sort of policy around how to help make it sort of more manageable in the meantime. Rent controls and those kinds of things could arguably help bridge the gap. What's your, talk to me about rent control. How does that work?
Can I just start I just wanted to go back slightly, because right to buy has been mentioned, and this is a really important point in the context actually of private renting, because I mean, I did some research a few years ago. We found that more than 4 in 10 of the council homes sold through right to buy in London are now rented out by private landlords. And in fact, local authorities are spending at least £20 million a year renting back their former properties at market rates, which is to house homeless families, which is absurd. And a lot of the private rented sector has been fueled by a combination of right to buy and buy to let. But specifically on rent control, absolutely right, it has to be part of a holistic approach, because ultimately we can't get away from the fact that we need a lot more social housing. We need a lot more council housing. Yeah. And we need the government to invest in that. But Obviously, that's going to take time to get built. I mean, we started a record number of affordable homes in London in the last year since the GLA began keeping records in 2003. But it takes time to build. In the meantime, you've got tenants living very precariously in the private rented sector who need security, because to me, rent control is as much about stability as it is about affordability.
Yeah.
Actually, you know, you've got as we heard earlier, you know, there are a lot more families with children living in the private rented sector. You know, having to, you know, if you have to move every sort of 6 to 12 months and you've got kids being taken in and out of school, it's so disruptive. Give people security and stability.
And I might come to Stephen R, if he's okay to come on screen, who is against rent control as a policy. Stephen, what's the counter argument? Are you there? Stephen, are you there? I think we've got the gremlins in. It's too hot. Let's try Daniel then. Daniel Dipper. Rent control must be done carefully. Hi, Daniel. Nice to see you. Not seen you for a bit.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of rent control, I can understand why it needs to be implemented. As I say, I just think it's got to be done carefully. So that, because I mean, what we've done with universities is we've set this maximum fee, but actually, like 95% of universities charge the maximum fee. So it's almost, it's not pointless because universities would have charged more if the rate was higher, but at the same time, it's not really given people any choice, and it hasn't actually made it that much better for people overall because they're all just charging the same rate. Yeah. So I think that rent control could work, but I think that there's other ways possibly of approaching it. And I mean, I will say I am slightly kind of leaning on these sort of things, but it's a case of possibly the rates are going up because there isn't enough competition. So we've got to look at how we introduce more competition. So I was saying in the chat, for example, about how maybe we need to create a reward for long-term tenants so that actually we're encouraging people to stay in the properties for a number of years. So it could be like there's a tax that landlords have to pay per tenant they take on. So kind of encouraging them to actually kind of stick with a tenant for a longer period of time and look into the ways like that. So we've not just got this, you know, constant turnover, because I think that, you know, there is a problem. There is a problem with people constantly being turfed out, changing where they are, and that isn't good for anybody. But I think we've got to look at ways of doing that that, you know, does actually mean that they're getting good quality accommodation and does provide for their needs.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I'm interested in Yasmin and Louise's chat, actually. They're talking about this in a slightly different way. Louise Simpson made, I think, an interesting comment about why it might be sort of almost emotionally that people feel they need to own a house is related to their feeling that they won't be looked after otherwise. It's sort of driven by fear. Louise, are you there, Louise Simpson? Hi, Louise. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I thought that was interesting.
Hello.
Hi. I thought your comment was really interesting about this sort of the motivation to want to buy a home.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if we all examine, you know, what owning things is and having money in the banks is, it's really because people are frightened because of for a rainy day. And actually, if people didn't have that fear profoundly because they trusted the state in which they lived, then the whole idea and the value of property would change. And you wouldn't have this, and you wouldn't have this kind of terrible exploitative value thing, which may or may not, I don't think it started with the buy-to-let, but it was certainly aggravated by it and increased because people saw it as a way of making money.
Yeah.
To live on, not just to exploit, but to actually create a sort of free income without sort of doing work. So of course the property has dried up. But no, it's just if you really go back to the basis of us all kind of trying to live together, then there is a real chance here, along with COVID, to kind of really go back to basics.
Thanks very much. Zav has made a fascinating point about Scotland, and actually it picks up on something that Andrew was saying earlier on about the relationship between the Scottish government and Airbnb. Zav, are you there? Xavier, I know you are because you've just typed in the chat. Come in, Zav. Oh, go on. Why would you go so quiet? This is so frustrating. We're not usually this unlucky. Oh, I have a terrible internet connection. It's trying to go somewhere better. Let's come back to Anne Ashworth, if we can. And how do you think, you've been observing the property market for years and years. You don't have a crystal ball, I know, but there was talk, quite a lot of talk actually, in a series of thinkings we did. I think it was in early June, where we were talking about how we live next. We talked a lot about everybody will work from home. It will mean that we don't need these big office blocks in the centre of town. Nobody wants to get the tube anymore because they'll be frightened of the germs. And we talked a lot about, we didn't really get anywhere. We sort of speculated a lot about the changing urban environment and what that might do to the sort of intense pressure on people wanting to get into as close to zone 2 as they could, and then edging into zone 3, because obviously zone 2 is impossible. What do you think is going to, how do you see all this panning out? Because it is impossible to, I mean, it's almost unaffordable to rent in the sort of central bit of London, and it's definitely difficult or impossible to buy a house now for many people. How do you see this playing out? Do you think it is all going to unravel and we'll all be cramming ourselves into the central line like we were before?
I suspect that how things seem now will not be how they seem a year from now. Remember that we may get a vaccine which will change everything. And meanwhile, I have this feeling that the aspiration for home ownership will burn as bright as it ever does. Whether it's realizable or not, I'm not clear. What I just think is that we know lockdown has accelerated change in many things, and there are some stuff that I think we should possibly try to address. Now, let me get back to the consultation document on planning that came out just last week. One of the things in it, there would be an extension of what they call permitted development rights. That allows you, without planning permission, just listen to that, to turn an office block into homes. Now, there's going to be more of that. Now, we're not going to be able to reform the whole of property, but let's just try and make the stuff that we build new, good, high quality homes. I know Tom has an awful lot of views on this. How are we going to ensure that the bits of the property market that we can't sort, because this is a massive, complex mechanism that's possibly beyond our control, is that if we're going to put up new homes, that they be good quality homes that meet space standards? And I wanted to ask Tom, what is going to be City Hall's view on this idea that we'll be able, even empty shops will be able to be changed into homes? We need to be thinking, if we're going to build, we need to build quality homes that will be the places in which we want to live in future, however, whether we rent them, whether we own them, and how they look in the public realm.
Go for it, Tom.
That's so important. And yes, I do have some very strong views on this. And I can assure you that myself and the mayor are lobbying government very hard to change their mind on this. When I looked into the issue of permitted development rights when I was on the London Assembly, we did some research and found that of the 16,000 that had been delivered, I don't like calling them homes, they're sort of boxes in which to exist, that are being created, these flats that are being created, only 0.4% were affordable, and 60% didn't meet minimum space standards. In fact, the government, literally the day it announced the extension of permitted development rights, published quietly a piece of research that they had commissioned, which found that was even worse. Nationally, 72% don't meet minimum space standards. The smallest we found was 10 meters square. And you've got ministers in the housing department who are, by all accounts, very well housed multiple times over, delivering new slum housing that they would never ever dream of living in or putting their families in themselves. And I just don't think that that's right. I don't think that's a solution to the housing crisis. I think that's a symptom of the housing crisis, and we shouldn't be making it easier for owners of office blocks to create new slums.
Tom, you said earlier that sort of almost no power lives in City Hall to sort of really materially affect some of these fundamental dynamics. So although our question tonight is who wins and who loses, you know, we're all about trying to find ways to close the power gap at Tortoise. It sounds to me depressingly like the same old people are winning even more as a consequence of the pandemic, and the same people are losing. But I don't really like the idea of walking away thinking, well, there's nothing that could be examined. There's nothing that could be looked at to say, it's about the quality of the development, or it's about the legislative environment about Airbnb. It's about clamping down on people cheating the system and having, you know, breaking the law about 90-day rent limits on Airbnb. What are the angles that are really the sharp end that we could go for, do you think?
Well, I think that Sadiq Khan has used his planning powers quite effectively, although unfortunately, you know, this new government planning consultation, you know, the legislation that results from that could threaten that progress. So on things like affordable housing, on the major schemes that come across the mayor's desk, we've gone from 22% affordable in 2014 to 38% last year. So traveling very much in the right direction. But we are really constrained in terms of London government just by the weakness of our devolution settlement, and this is historic. You know, we don't have the powers that Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have to run the city in the way that we would like to run the city. We are so reliant on government. So Airbnb, we are reliant on the government to change the regulations. On private renting, we are reliant on the government to reform. It's very frustrating, and unfortunately, although we've had a sort of we had been seeing a sort of move towards more devolution in England. Now I think we're going the other way, and this government is determined to centralise even more power in Whitehall rather than handing it to communities.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to try and go back to Jess Dowson, who's been making some bracing. Hi, Jess. Are you there now?
I am, yes.
Oh,
Can you hear me okay?
Now, just in case people missed it, because you were walking around your house before, you're an architect. Training or trained?
Trainee. I'm not an architect. I'm an architectural assistant. I've done my part 1 and I'm going to do my part 2.
Oh, good luck. It's a long old haul, isn't it?
It is. Thank you, yes.
Tell us some of the things you've been saying, because you've got very strong feelings about this.
Yeah. During undergraduate, one of our undergraduate projects is in fact based upon housing, and numerous of my former classmates took housing into their final projects as well. One of the first courses or projects we do at the university I'm going to do my master's at is again based upon housing. Housing features at great length in many universities through parts 1 and 2. And it's also something that our tutors constantly bring up, and we do as well, because as students, majority of us are either living at home and commuting in, or in private rented, the quality of which varies. I've got a unique perspective in that I was a student 10 years ago, and I was a student a few years ago again. So, case in point, I was incredibly lucky with the place I had in Edinburgh, private rented. A similar quality place, which was only 1-bed studio. The Edinburgh place was 2-bed. It was the same price. And that's 10 years later in Canterbury, of which I, just off the cuff, I'd guess probably similar levels of land value, if not Edinburgh is more expensive. Goodness knows what the cost of the flat was in Edinburgh now. But anyway, when it comes to, as I mentioned in chat just now, I feel that there's a lot more stick needed with regards to the development of genuinely good quality, affordable housing stock throughout the country, not just in London. As has been mentioned before, the housing isn't really being built for housing at the moment. I've long since assumed that the housing is in fact being built as assets, which has been confirmed in chat and confirmed in press. And it's not, it's no longer being we're no longer the customers. It's conglomerates, local or foreign, whatever. They're all the same in this instance. And it isn't a case of creating good quality housing to live in. It's a creation of creating useful assets to diversify holdings. That needs to change as well. If the housing crisis has any hope of being assuaged, as it were. So
just
the other issue, sorry, one last issue is, and that's what I see as the lack of architectural involvement in an awful lot of these developments, not just flats in London, but housing developments in the countryside. I rarely hear of architectural involvement at all, and the times, like there was one egregious case recently in London about office conversion, where they're creating coffins, and rightly so, the architects in question were publicly shamed. That needs to happen more, and that needs to happen far more kind of viscerally, I think, for there to be any change. And architects worth the sort need to be getting more involved. I think we're seen as a hindrance to the process because we leech money from the process, and I'm not entirely certain how to change that without giving REBA a massive kick up the backside.
Jess, you wrote in the chat that developers routinely and consistently game the system in order to reduce requirements. And you're suggesting that more stick and less carrot would be a way to redress that. I'd just like to know what would the stick look like?
Financial, it would have to be financial. Money is the only language
Fine.
which there's any response.
Incentives for...
I think not necessarily just fines, because fines probably people find a way of wheezing out to them, or the fine just becomes tuppence for a massive development, or the developers find a way of nullifying the fine through other means. It needs to be more along the lines of business ending financial ruin rather than just a fine, likes of taken to court, licenses revoked, along with the equivalent of preventing the management of whichever developer from managing development agencies again. So similar penalties as to a person who declares bankruptcy. They can't become a trustee, they can't form their own companies again. I think extreme measures such as that, or at least threatening such extreme measures, are the only way to bring this back into check.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's go to Helena, who's had her hand up for a while. Are you there, Helena? Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I think that a really interesting point that's been made in the chat has been on the point about community. And I think that really this is a sort of a two-part problem with our system that is damaging community relations. So firstly, we've really incentivized, I say we, politically, it has been incentivized to build low quality new properties rather than develop them. And I remember a statistic quoted a few general elections ago in my constituency of Telford, that for a time in our, at least in our surrounding area, we had something ludicrous, like 10 empty homes per family that lives on the streets in Telford, which is bonkers to me. But I think that more generally, that does foster this sort of this chasm between people, because we have this not in my backyard approach to property development, when still we obviously do need houses, but also we talk about cities, and it's really creating tensions, and I've experienced this, between students and non-students, because we generally don't want to be in those large blocks that we speak about. And I also don't think that practically they're always necessary if we did actually incentivize property development. And secondly, as well as incentivizing the development of new properties rather than renovation, I think we have actually decentivized developing properties at all. So again, I talk about university. I lived in the same flat for 3 years. I never met my landlord. We rented through a letting agent, but we knew that our landlord owned multiple properties in Edinburgh. We didn't have any communication with them about the condition of the property at all. It just so happened that I met the person who used to live in the flat before me. And they said that when they moved out, their landlord had told them that the flat was being taken off the market in order for essential repairs to be conducted, basically, before it would be rented again. Obviously, we moved straight in immediately after that. So I think that actually when you look at how this system has worked. It has really damaged community relations, and I think it will continue to do so unless we do something about it.
Okay, thanks, Elena. Tom, can I come back to you just as we come into the last 5 minutes before I try and do a sum up? I'm thinking about those families who, well, households, you know what, let's not presuppose their families, they may be other combinations of people who have fallen into arrears and who are facing eviction or a court case, as you explained earlier on, that may begin on the 24th of August. Families who haven't managed to sort of negotiate with their landlord as sort of kindly, you know, whatever. What will happen to those families and households? Who will they call? Where will they go? And do you think it's going to be an avalanche of homelessness as has been warned, or will it sort of dissipate?
I think it's going to be more like a tsunami. It's going to build more gradually. I mean, first of all, of course, the courts can only process so many cases at once.
Yeah.
I believe the government have removed the rule, or they've changed the rule so that these cases don't have to be heard within, I think, 2 months, which is the usual requirement. What happens to people will to some degree depend on circumstances. So there'll be anyone to whom a local authority has a statutory duty. So if you're a family with children, for example, you know, may well end up in temporary accommodation. People may, of course, end up being forced to go, you know, move back in with family or in with friends, sofa surfing. And of course, you know, it's quite likely that those people who the local authority has no statutory duty to, who can't move in with family and friends, we are likely to see an increased flow of people onto the streets. And I'm extremely worried about that. Rough sleeping in London, you know, even before we went into COVID, was already, you know, too high. One person on the street is too high, and we're likely to see more people pushed onto the street, sadly, as a result of the eviction ban ending and furlough ending.
Thank you. That's a kind of a bleak note on which to end.
Sorry.
But that's not your fault. I asked a question. It's 28 minutes past 7, so I am meant to try and pull together some threads of what we've talked about. This is a huge topic and it's quite complicated in parts. So forgive me if I've missed leads or if I've not drilled down enough into them. There's some interesting stuff happening in the chat that's looking at land ownership. We've talked a lot about, you know, a package of measures. It needs to be multi-layered. It's probably a bit of stick and a bit of carrot. So there's a lot in here. I want to. There's a couple of things that have stuck with me. The first thing being that the people who are private renters are not a small group of people, nor are they only young people. There are older people and families, what you might consider the whole gamut of society who now are private tenants, and their housing situation is by definition more vulnerable than those people who've managed to buy or own a house. And you might say that the way things are going, that group of people is only going to get larger. So the fact that there was only one mention of rent in the white paper would suggest to me that the Housing Secretary and Ministers and Department are perhaps missing, you know, they're sort of looking in the wrong direction as to who we need to be worried about, is the first thing. I remain interested in, although I don't think we've landed on exactly the question, in Airbnb as almost you know, as an organisation that's more powerful than policy, that can create ripples in renting prices and stock availability, good and bad for renters and people looking for accommodation. And I just wonder how the sort of legislative environment to all of the various constituent parts that operate around Airbnb, not just the Airbnb corporate, but all of the, you know, the property owners, the people who own multiple properties, the people who build to let and then use Airbnb as their platform. I sort of predict that there is going to be a more significant social and possibly political and legislative sort of downstream impact on that. I was fascinated to hear from Tom about the sort of, I forget the word you used, the sort of slightly toothless devolution settlement, which makes a very frustrating scenario at City Hall when you can see it right there and you can understand the detail of it, but yet you're sort of hampered in your ability to fix immediate problems of quality accommodation, amount of accommodation, homelessness, and the sort of principles. And I do feel that as a sort of philosophical starting point for us, being as we are a newsroom that exists to try and tackle and understand ways to unravel the power gap, this idea that the reason why people want to buy a house is because they don't feel that the state or anybody else is going to look after them. And actually, yes, thank you, Paul. That clip, James Temperton, I think his name is, the journalist who's done extensive and I think very good investigative reporting for Wired about Airbnb, is really worth reading. So thanks, Paul, for putting that link in. I think this idea of if we can consider a safe place to live as a human right, then it does help us sort of in terms of how we think about housing policy and things. I also think what Jess said about developers routinely gaming the system to reduce requirements, I don't think we got quite to the answer of how that might be tackled, but I do think that there may be something for us to discover and a story to tell about large corporations who end up on the receiving end of the big contracts to build stuff, and how that ends up making its way into the hands of the right or wrong people, or just nobody at all because it's spec'd in the wrong way. There's a lot in there. Thank you very much. I'm 2 minutes over. I'm so sorry. You can tell I've been off for a week because I'm on the go slow, which I suppose being Tortoise, it should be okay for me to be on the go slow. But thank you very much for joining us. Go and have a cold drink, put your feet on an ice cube, and do join us again tomorrow lunchtime if you can face it. We've got open news, and tomorrow evening Matt Haig, the mental health writer and campaigner, on his latest book. So thank you very much and have a lovely evening.